unvalidated the vast majority of people are by just simply lending an ear to listen and actually being completely heard with what they have to say. And there was quite a few years ago where somebody had made the comments that coaching would be something that would be a great idea to get into. And it's something that I never really ever thought of, because when I thought coach, I always thought like the basketball coach, the football coach,
Yes.
and so it was never really something that I ever thought to actually persevere. Originally, I actually wanted to be a gym owner, personal trainer. I used to own a gym. That's a completely different entrepreneur story for a different time, that's for sure.
Wow.
I learned a lot.
Yeah.
So that was originally my go-to, and then I actually got into the nightclub industry, where I spent the 5 years prior to COVID. And let me tell you, I learned more about myself and about people in general working there. I have stories that your imagination can't even fathom, like things that they haven't even made movies about yet.
Wow. Wow.
But ultimately, what really solidified actually, me becoming a coach, it was realizing while working in the clubs that lending an ear to somebody who listened yet again, and having people from all age groups of all walks of life, holding them in your arms, crying because I was simply that one ear to listen. And so during COVID, I no longer had any more excuses of putting off getting the certifications and such. So I basically told myself, I'm like, well, if I don't do this now, then it's clearly just my discipline and initiative. So I finished her off and built this. And so far, it has been probably one of the most rewarding experiences I have yet to experience.
Wow, wow, Dylan, what a story. And it sounds to me like you went through that transition, it's as if you were moving through that process, trying to find yourself there, trying to identify what exactly do you want to do. You came out of the nightclub industry, you presently own a gym. That's a big shift from there to there. How did that happen? Was that easy for you?
No. It's so I transitioned from working in the oil field, then from the oil field into the entrepreneurship of being a personal trainer and owning a gym, and then into the clubs, and then now into the coaching. And I can say that each, funny enough, those transitions also happened with the biggest changes in my life. So when I moved to Red Deer, was one of the first times I moved away from my family. And then I was also moving into a completely different oil field position with a woman who is, no longer in my life due to just, different paths. That was very difficult because she had a little one who I cared for. So I went from being single, working in the oil field, to jumping into a family life, to then jumping out of the oil field into the entrepreneurship, and then really coming to terms with the hard reality that there's a right way and a wrong way to do entrepreneurship. And I did it kind of leaning more towards the wrong way, because the rest of my life ended up falling to pieces because I put so much time and effort into it and kind of lost track of everything else. And there was a moment actually where it was the last year before we had closed the gym, when I was the year after we had closed the gym, where I was actually driving down this golf course road that's by my house, which is very beautiful in the fall. And I was admiring the colors on the leaves, and I had realized that I had not been mindful for the last 5 years, and the last 5 years kind of went by in a blur. So there's pieces of my journey in owning the gym that I don't even remember, because I was just coasting through life.
Wow.
So when I had started up the gym with my business partner, who was one of my best friends and very fortunately is still one of my best friends, he moved on to bigger and better things. He's now a very, very talented tattoo artist. Um, when I made that transition, we started the gym. I did not pull a wage from the gym. So I had started working part-time as a security guard in the nightclubs.
Mm.
Now, let me tell you,
Hmm.
working a job like that with zero self-confidence was absolute torture every single day. There were
Mm.
days where I was driving to work where it literally looked like I pissed in my armpits because I was sweating so profusely because I was so anxious to go to work. But
Mm.
I had to do what I had to do at the time because I had to provide for my family.
Mm.
And this was the first step into really finding my true authentic self, because in a position like security, you have to have self-confidence. You can't be passive. You can't be able to not talk to people, which I was not good at. Both
Mhm.
strangers, pretty women, did not matter. Horrible conversation skills, unless I knew you from like school or any sort of rapport that was built through friendship otherwise. Um, so the transition in the nightclub, that 5 years was a bit of a whirlwind, because during that 5 years, um, the woman that was in my life at that time, her and I split. We closed the gym. I then moved fully into the nightlife industry, which you reverse your life 100%. So I was going to bed at 5:30, 6 in the morning. I was getting up at noon, 1 in the afternoon, and my day was completely reversed. So I would do everything that normal people would do after work, before work, and then basically getting off of work and then going straight to bed. Also not conducive for said relationship that ended up failing. So in that time and witnessing the things that I witnessed there and learning how to ask the proper questions of myself, of those around me, it was a very tough choice to make the decision to get out of the nightlife, because the nightlife, it becomes very addictive. I am an introvert. I like to be at home alone, away from people. But when you are in a room with lights, music, hundreds and hundreds of people that are partying, it becomes an addiction. You get addicted to that atmosphere in all aspects, the highs and the lows. The
Mm.
highs of everyone having fun, and the lows of, oh, it's go time. These two people are fighting, so we got to get security to back it up, right? So we're going on the one side of the high of the euphoria, and then we're hitting that dopamine adrenaline fix when we're breaking up a fight, right?
Mhm.
So it was when COVID hits, I had said that I wasn't going back, but there was still a piece of me that was like, I don't know. I don't know. I might. But fortunately, through our mutual friend, John, he happened to just come into my life at the exact right time and for a reason, of course. And so him and I had a conversation, and it just kind of lit the little fire under my ass that I needed to actually start getting the actual proper certifications for doing the coaching aspect of what I've been doing for years prior already anyways. And then he helped me basically build every part of my business, of the root of it from the foundation up, and has been a very positive influence and a very respected mentor in my life. And fortunately, even through COVID, I have gone through enough personal growth, or I shouldn't say enough. Let me rephrase that. I've gone through more personal growth in the last year than I have in the 5 prior to the nightclubs. And it's been quite wonderful in that regard, where when I look around and I see a lot of my peers who, their relationships are going to shambles, or they were very heavy gym goers and then decided to no longer go to the gym or try and keep up with their fitness. It was very very difficult for me to see a lot of my friends and colleagues almost give up, so to speak, because I felt for them, because I understood what that felt like. And but fortunately, I've been able to influence a few of them to go get back on the horse and stuff like that. And yeah, so that's kind of that metamorphosis of going through all those transitions. And then on top of all of that, throw in a nice, lovely quad tear that pulled me out of the sport of powerlifting and put me up in a leg cast for 9 months out of work too. So
Oh wow. Oh
yeah,
wow. Oh wow.
yeah.
Dylan, well, it sounds, as I'm listening to your story, it's so interesting because that question I find comes up a lot in our psyches, which is I don't know. I really don't know. Am I going to go back? Maybe not. But then you talked about that 5 years that was like a blurb. How did, it's so interesting, but how did you come from this guy who was, introvert, anxious about going out, but still going because, as I say, a man's got to do what a man's got to do, to that place where your confidence level now is at a different space? What happened? What changed for you?
One simple thing. I made a choice.
Hmm.
I made the choice to no longer be that person,
Mm-hmm.
because that person that I was living, that shell, that facade, wasn't me. I grew up my entire life always seeking approval from others, feeling as if I was never good enough, feeling that I had to win attention or compete for attention. Now, the funny thing is, though, like, it didn't have anything to do with my parents. Now, like, I love both my parents dearly. We have our indifferences. Um, mm, Unfortunately, my father and I more so. But all the differences aside that we dealt with, their parenting parts, I owe all of my morals to my parents. I owe my work ethic to my parents, because um, they showed me the value in it. And to make the choice to be confident, I came from a place not necessarily of like, I want to be confident. It was more so I needed to be confident. And not necessarily a way I recommend for other people to do it. Of course, it worked for me that way. It'll work for somebody else that way. But it was more so my confidence became an adaptation, is kind of how I can sum it up in a nutshell.
Mm.
Um, I became confident working in the clubs because I had to. I became confident to be able to talk to people because I had to. And I realized that, to not have confidence enough to even be able to walk up to a stranger in the grocery store and compliment them on their shoes, or say that, hey, that's a badass looking shirt or something like that, that just didn't sit well with me, because it would be the first thought I would have to go do it, but then I'd have a million and one voices or reasons telling me why I shouldn't, because it's stupid, because they're just going to think poorly of me, or whatever the anxiety ridden conclusions that we make up in our head. So essentially, I I just made the choice that was no longer who I wanted to be. And the biggest thing that I learned with that was that vulnerability, that wall, that place and space that we hate to be. I learned to use that as a tool. Is as soon as I got that gut wrenching feeling in my stomach, I knew I had to lean into it, because I almost referred it to like the gym, right? Being a competitive athlete for so many years and in the fitness industry for so many years, you'll learn that the growth mental and physical, comes from that very, very vulnerable place.
Mm.
And so when I was able to, like, I understood it, but until I actually understood it, it just didn't click for me. And thankfully, it clicked. It just one day just kind of clicked. And it was through a few different experiences actually that happened in the nightclubs or during that 5-year span where it clicked. And, you know, my time in the clubs actually is one of the main reasons why I'm a very big believer that everything happens for a reason. And because, you know, before working in the clubs, I never stepped foot in either of those two clubs ever. But yet then I started working there just because I needed to. Now, I wasn't, the reason being is because I wasn't a club goer. So that 5 years, that half decade, I believe was placed there specifically for me and be like, all right, well, this is who you want to be. We're going to make you whatever higher power, the universe is, just be like, yeah, we're going to make you step into that true, authentic you, or at least start getting me going into that direction. And lo and behold, that brings us to today.
You know, Dylan, I'm listening to you, and do you know that what I'm hearing you're saying is that, Rolando, you know, I had to be willing to be uncomfortable and journey into a place of vulnerability and make the choice. You said some powerful things there, you know, Dylan, that I just want to reiterate because I want to help my listeners, all the men who are listening to this podcast right now, okay, those who may be listening to the pre-recording, to recognize that there are three powerful things that you just said that I want to reiterate before I went on to my next question. Number one is that if you really want to change, you have to recognize that you are going to have to be willing to get uncomfortable. Number
Absolutely.
two, if you really want to change, you are going to have to be willing to open yourself up and become vulnerable. And number three, you have to be willing to make that choice. That's so powerful, Dylan. I could not have had it said any better than the way that you said it.
Well, I
And
appreciate
so
you pointing that out.
I'm telling you, that's it's so powerful and it's so real, and that's one of the things, Dylan, that we promote here at XY Spark. Healthy masculinity. Understand that if I'm going to change, if I'm going to have balance, I'm going to have to be willing to be vulnerable and be uncomfortable because change is normally uncomfortable. Okay, but it takes us in the right direction, and then
Yep,
making that choice, you know. And you know, Dylan, one of the things that I say is one of the greatest gifts that you and I have as human beings is the gift of choice.
absolutely.
Okay. And that's why when I ask and you said choice, I say, I think Dylan has been listening to me, man. I don't know.
I've caught a few of them.
But that's powerful, man. Thanks for that. Now, I wanted to ask you, tell me about the exact moment or the incident that made your perspective on how we all treat each other change. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I sure can. It was a very impactful moment actually. Every time I think about it, it actually gives me goosebumps because it's a very
Mm,
unfortunate story to it happened with this
mm,
individual. So in my time at the clubs, there was two clubs. They're side by side. One was a country bar, one was a top 40. So we had one individual that was in the top 40 clubs, and he was causing us a lot of issues. So we had to remove him. In removing him, he managed to start about half a dozen fights. And fortunately, nothing of it was too bad where nobody wanted to press charges. So we didn't have to call the RCMP or anything like that yet. So we get him outside. He ended up walking off. So we're like, okay, good, done. Don't have to deal with it. So we go back into our stations. And then I get a call over the radio saying that there's somebody in the other bar now starting a fight. So I'm like, okay, so go back to the other bar. It's the same gentleman. So we do the same thing, get him out. This time, though, unfortunately, he had pissed off a few people, and these few people wanted to press charges now. So this was the middle of winter. It was during one of the little warm spells, so it was only like -5, not overly cold. Now, this guy just looked like he looked like he was battling his demons. And so I just had my doorman simply just surround him. I had already called the RCMP. They were on their way. They were about 5 minutes away. And so he just kind of sat there. And while he was in there on the ground, he started beating his own head off the ground to make it look like the doorman beat him up. So cops come. I give him the lowdown. What's going on? The cops are already familiar with this gentleman's family. So that night ends. All is well. A few weeks later, I find out that I had a mutual friend with this individual who caused me so many issues that night. And he was asking me about some of the events that had happened. And he had made the comment, he's like, man, like, it's really unfortunate to hear that that happened. And I'm like, oh, like, why? What's going on? And then this guy told me that it was a week prior to that day, he walked in on his mother hanging from the ceiling.
Wow.
So,
Mm.
excuse me.
Mhm.
It was that very moment where I realized that we don't have a clue of what goes on in other people's life to even justify having a guess as to why someone is acting the way they're acting. You know, that server that you have that might be less than desirable. Well, she could have just found out she lost custody of her kid that morning. You know,
Mhm.
the cashier at the grocery store who's very short with you just found out that morning that they're getting a divorce. Whatever the case may be, we don't know.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
yeah, that was a pretty big one, and
Mhm.
it still sticks with me because that's not something that somebody should have to see.
Mhm. Mhm. Wow, wow. And yeah, I can't imagine, Dylan, and thank you for sharing that, and thank you for feeling, that this is a safe space for you to tell that story, and we continue to say here, Dylan at XY Spark, that as a therapist myself, I say to men, find a safe space and process that trauma, because that's what we call vicarious trauma. The impact of what happened in somebody else's life has trickled down on you. And even today, you're sharing that story, it's still striking a chord, which says, hey, you know what? Just find that safe space and go and tell your story and get that healing from that.
Well, I appreciate you creating a safe space.
Thank you. Wow, that's definitely a tough story. And Dylan, I can tell you in my own way as a therapist, I've had to find a way to to take care of my own mental health, as I hear so many of those stories in my role as
Yep.
well. So I totally understand where you're coming from. But the point that you made is so powerful because as men, that's why we cannot allow ourselves to have this emotional disconnect. Because if you never had that emotional intelligence to really empathize with that brother, the feelings that you're feeling now and this where it would be like, hey, whatever, things happen and people die and, I mean, whatever. But it says a lot about who you are as a person and the heart that you have and the love that you have for other men like yourself and people in the community. So thank you for pointing that out. And guys, that is such a great thing for us to recognize as men and promoting healthy masculinity, where we're not so narcissistic that we can't feel what somebody else feels, that we can't relate or we can connect with that. So Dylan, really amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And I appreciate hearing that. You know, uh,
Absolutely.
let's let that sink in a little bit before we move on to our next question. Okay. Um, and so, that story, Dylan, that incident, it brought a change. And tell us a little bit now about when you made the choice to be happy and discovered the power of mindset. And this, I think, folks, I want to tell you, brace yourself, because I think this is going to be the crescendo of us having Dylan here this evening. So tell us, Dylan, what happened after you made that choice to be happy? Walk us through that, please, if you could.
Okay, so there's technically two parts of this story, and you'll understand why when I get to it. So I have a very close friend of mine. He is a very, very respected individual in this community. Especially in the emergency services, everyone knows who he is. He is a fire medic, and he is probably one of the most selfless people that I have, ever met. He quite literally, if he was to walk out of a burning building and he only had the clothes on him, that was it, and he found somebody that needed it more than him, he would give him those clothes. And that's not even just blowing smoke up his ass. Like, this, probably one of the most genuine hearts I've ever met. The unfortunate thing is he was also a yes man. This guy was at every single charity event. Anytime anyone asked anything of him, it was always a yes. And he ended up getting walked on in aspects of his personal life. Now, he is who I learned how, when life is telling you to slow down, you need to listen, or life will make you slow down. So, as I said, my buddy is a firefighter, very good shape. And he was training with another friend of mine who is a competitive bodybuilder. And so they were on the leg press, and they were going through the sets, and about halfway through the sets, and my buddy racks it and looks up to my friend, or my other friend, and he's like, "I need you to call 911." And of course, the bodybuilder is like, just like, "Oh, whatever," right? Because he's a paramedic and thought he was just joking. He's like, "No, I'm serious. You need to call an ambulance." And so what had happened is that he had ruptured his aorta valve. And when they were rushing him to the hospital, he ended up having a stroke. He's in his late 30s, early 40s, somewhere in and around there. Very, very good shape. But life, he was not listening to life telling him to slow down. He was not listening to life telling him to practice self-love and self-care. So life was basically told him, nope, now you are. He had to relearn how to do everything. The stroke took his speech from him, the ability to walk, to work. And to see him to this day, you would never guess. He has made a full 100% recovery, able to walk, run, talk. You would never guess he had this stroke. He was told that he wasn't going to be able to go back to work, or that he might never walk again. And so he is one of those success stories. Unfortunately, it came out of him being a yes man, he was pouring from an empty cup, essentially, to put it in a nutshell. Now, this leads into my part. There was a time in my life, 2019, the end of 2019, where I just felt out of sorts. I was already beginning the self-work, but nothing was working. And I still had too much of a pessimistic mindset, whereas anything that somebody would tell me, I would accept it in the moment, but then I would find a new narrative in my personal life at home as to why it wasn't real, or why I didn't deserve it, or why I wasn't good enough, all that lovely self-deprecating talk. So it was how this week planned out. It was literally a Monday to Friday thing. So I was at the gym on a Monday, and my buddy who had gone through all of this was also there. And so I had asked him, or I asked him what he had done if he had ever been in this position. And the only advice he was able to give me were his exact words. He said, I don't want to give you any major advice other than this one thing, is to practice the self-work now. Not later, now. So, of course, we chit-chatted a little bit, and, you know, he gave me some ideas on some books or some people to listen to, some, you know, motivational speakers or whatnot. So I managed to find this book. It was an audiobook on YouTube, and it was the Power of Positive Thinking. All set around how the mind works. And, you know, I was reading it or listening to it, sorry, and it was a good listen. Of course, I still had that critiquing part of my brain still burning on or firing on all cylinders. But I had to go to a doctor's appointment that Tuesday. And this doctor's appointment was for blood work because I have to get my hormones monitored. I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism when I was 12, and essentially my hormones were all out of whack throughout my teen years. And at 19, my body was just like, nope, no more testosterone. So I have to get everything checked quite regularly. So I had to go to a walk-in clinic for this specific appointment. And I tell the doctor, I'm like, hey, can you test me for a full panel? But don't worry about contacting me if this, and this is out by a little bit. I know it's going to be out. And so he made his notes and all was done. So the week continued, and Thursday afternoon, I finished listening to that book. Thursday at about 4:25, so 5 minutes before the doctor's office closed, I get a call saying that I have to go in tomorrow to go over my blood work. Now, in this blood panel, they were also testing me for 5 different types of cancer. So I asked the teller, or the front desk lady, I'm like, this is a big test. Like, can you give me some sort of information over the phone? And they're like, no, we can't do that because there's no way that we know it's actually you. And so I sat there for a minute. I'm like, you do realize what I was being tested for? Like, you're now letting this sit with me for another day, unknowing, like, you're like, just let thoughts run in my head. Mm-hmm. And basically she's just like, I'm sorry, sir, we're closing right now and I can't give you that information. Mm-hmm. So that night I was kind of, you know, bouncing all over the place. And then I woke up Friday morning and I was really trying to work hard, really trying to like, just like keep myself together, not assuming to the worst. Mm-hmm. And so driving to the clinic, I made a choice as to this is my last and final test of this, is the power of mindsets. And I told myself everything was going to be okay. Everything was going to turn out just fine. So get into the clinic, check in, go sit in the waiting room for the longest 3.5 hours of my life.
3.5 hours. That's a long time.
3.5 hours in the waiting room, bouncing back and forth between this thought and struggle of whether or not I was going to be diagnosed with cancer. So I finally get called into the doctor's room, and another 5 minutes goes by, which just feels like eternity after 3.5 hours of waiting. Mm-hmm. So of course, this is a new doctor because, again, this was a walk-in clinic. And so I gave him the lowdown of what was going on. And so he pulls up my file on the computer, and a couple minutes passing as he's reading the monitor and humming and hawing, and he closes it, exit, turns to me, and he's like, I have no idea why they called you in. Everything is fine.
Wow. The universe smiled on you.
So I then had to, because I told myself, like, this is the last test.
Yes.
This is where I'm going to see if this mindset stuff actually works. And it did. And so I was still working in the clubs at that time.
Mhm.
And I remember going and speaking to my boss, and I told her, and I'm like, there's one day she's like, you're acting weird. And I'm like, yeah, I know. I feel weird. She's like,
Mhm.
well, why? I'm like, because I'm choosing to be happy. I'm choosing to not look at happiness as an end destination anymore. I'm choosing to stop and actually appreciate the colors of the leaves on the trees and the smell of the flowers, and actually being mindful and in the moment. And in that one day, I had probably about a dozen different people come up to me and make some sort of comment that I was acting different than normal. And it got to the point I was like asking, I'm like, man, was I really like that negative before? Like, was I that bad? And I actually asked that to the last handful, and they're like, oh no, it's just your energy is different. You're carrying yourself different. There is a weight that is no longer sitting on your shoulders. And that was it. Now, like, don't get me wrong, I'm not happy all the time, of course, but I understand now that it's not an end destination. It is a perception of how we receive the moment that's in front of us.
Wow, wow. And guys, I love what you just said, Dylan, because that brings me back to what I call an XY Spark mantra, which is personal development is not an event, it's a lifestyle. And so you made the choice to start living and doing. Years ago, I heard this expression, which I want to reiterate here, Dylan, with you, is that you form your world with your words. And here's a typical example to all the men who are listening. Here is Dylan, and he's saying, listen, I made that choice. Do you notice how many times this evening that word came up? I made the choice to start feeding my mind with more positive words, words of affirmation. I started to spend more time to be mindful. Dylan said I started to spend time to look at the color of the leaves, and smell it. That's powerful, guys. This is one of those skills that Dylan, as men, we don't really know how to do. We don't really know how to do. We go to the gym and we do, bench presses, and we work on getting abs, and we work on getting triceps and biceps, and we do dead weight and stuff. But what's ironic is, even after we leave the gym, we're still carrying around a lot of weight. And that weight that we carry around is not one that we can see on the outside. And it's when, on what I'm hearing you're saying is, Rolando, when I made the choice to relieve myself of that, everyone started to look at me and say, you're different. You're acting weird. Now, here's what's ironic, Dylan. We're living in a society today now where whenever men start living the way that they were supposed to be living in the first place, people are identifying that as being weird because they want to see the normal behavior. So what happens? Society has flipped it. Whenever you're doing something that's healthy and good and contagious, people's way of kind of like, hey, what's that? People are scared of that, there. That's the thing. When people see a male or someone, and I'm not talking about alpha males who are, and I'm not like I'm hating on alpha males. Okay, don't get me wrong. I'm not talking about men who are putting on this facade. I'm talking about men who have really tapped into something that you have tapped into. Whenever men start doing that, people's way of hiding or saying, hey, what's this? I'm not used to that. They refer to it as weird. So it comes across as, hey, is it okay for me to be this way as a man? Or should I be the way based on what society has laid down for me? And so I'm really excited, Blaine, that you said that, because this is what it is, folks. This is what healthy masculinity is. Find your niche, be happy, be mindful, okay? Be human. And that is a skill that we all have to choose. Hear the word coming again, Dylan? We have
Yep.
to choose that. And when we choose that, if I go all the way back, Dylan, to something you said earlier, you know, when you said that, I almost got excited in my seat, but I said, let me contain myself. But when you said, Dylan, that Rolando, there was like a little light. There was a little light there, Rolando, that was like, hey, it's time. That light, Dylan, is what we call the spark.
Mm-hmm.
Because at XY Spark, we say, hey, there is a spark in you. Let's work together to ignite that spark so that you can be the best version of you. Dylan, what an amazing, amazing story. Thank you so much, man, for being. I could listen to you tell your story all evening, man, but I don't want to weary you or my listeners. But you know, Dylan, just before we close, if someone would want to connect with you, if someone says, hey, you know, I like what this guy is saying, he seems real, he seems genuine, he seems like someone I'd like to be my coach, how could they find you? How could they reach you?
So first and foremost, my email is coach@thewolverinelifestyle.com. I
Mm-hmm.
can also be found on Facebook, which is the Facebook beginning part, and then Dylan.Andres, or if you search up Dylan Wolverine Andres, or simply the Wolverine Lifestyle, there is the business page as well. Coach Wolverine on Instagram, at Coach_Wolverine on Twitter now. There's nothing going on there because I just started it 2 days ago. And also the Wolverine Lifestyle on YouTube.
Great. Thank you, Dylan. So, folks, you see, the only place that you could actually see someone actually interviewing the Wolverine is here on XY Spark in the form of Dylan. Okay. And so, Dylan, we appreciate you. Thank you for the great work that you are doing. And guys, we thank you for joining us here on XY Spark. As usual, we continue to say, this is your boy, Rolando. And we continue to remind you that we believe that there is a spark in you. And we will see you again in our next broadcast. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care, everyone.